So welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. And joining me on this week's episode is Fiona Edwards Murphy, CEO and co-founder of Apis Protect, an Irish ag tech company using innovative technology to help protect the health of honeybees, one of our most important insect allies in helping us nourish the world's growing population. So Fiona, great that you could join us and agree to come onto the show today. It's great to see you.
Great, thanks so much, Simon. It's fantastic to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Now tell me, did I get the intro right? Is that how you would position the company?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're spot on. I think how I like to introduce us is we, use technology to help beekeepers reduce losses and increase productivity in their operations. So
great, no,
pretty
great.
bang on.
So tell me, let's take it all the way back. I'm really interested in the journey. Well, what were growing up? I'm just thinking, what were the real fundamental and early kind of influences on a young Fiona?
Well, I think there is a few that I certainly wasn't even aware of at the time. I mean, my background is in engineering, so I came at Apis Protect from the technology side. But I've always been really interested in technology, computers, electronics. So it definitely wasn't a surprise that I ended up going into engineering. But I think what for me eventually was very surprising was the ag rather than the tech of ag tech. I come from a town called Kanturk, which is in North Cork. So very, very rural part of Ireland, surrounded by farms and farmers and farming. Would have gone to school with a lot of farmers. Had absolutely no interest whatsoever in agriculture. Like, as far as I was concerned, as I was, going to school, going to secondary school, I was going off to university, and I was never going to leave the city again. I guess that's kind of like, if you ask 16-year-old Fiona, what do you think you're going to end up doing? It certainly wouldn't have been where I am today. But I think how I ended up going basically back around in a big circle to agriculture was during university. I got involved with a research group called the Embedded Systems Group in the electrical engineering department. Basically really fell in love with sensors and sensor applications. So, the idea of using the technology I was learning about to actually achieve something meaningful in the real world was what I absolutely fell in love with. So I worked on a variety of different projects with that group, things like, structural health monitoring, which is like, monitoring bridges and tunnels and stuff like that, and human health monitoring. And, eventually decided, okay, I don't want a real job. I want to do my PhD. I want to, spend all of my time working on applications of sensor technologies, which eventually became the Internet of Things. It didn't have that name back then.
So what was the PhD? What was it called, the PhD?
The title was, it's a long title like they always are, but to summarize it, it's basically sensor applications for honeybees. So it was at the point where I started my PhD was where I kind of made the link back into agriculture.
Okay, right.
Yeah. The head of the lab, the Embedded Systems Group, he's a Romanian guy. And his dad was a beekeeper back in Romania. So he was telling me a story about how when he was a kid, they used to, in the middle of winter, when the bees were buried under, the hives were buried under, loads of snow, they used to go out with stethoscopes and listen to try and hear if they could hear the buzzing inside in the beehive, and that would tell them if that beehive was still alive or not, because one of the biggest challenges in beekeeping is to understand what's happening. You have to open the beehive, and if it's cold, if it's wet, if it's a variety of, if it's anything other than a nice sunny day, basically you're taking a big gamble by opening the beehive. So they would be listening with their stethoscopes to see if they were still alive or not, to try and judge how many beehives they would have in the spring. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And at the same time, in beekeeping, that was a really interesting, so this would have been kind of 2012, 2013. That was a really interesting time in beekeeping in general, because that was really the peak of colony collapse disorder, which was, this huge problem. It was happening throughout the globe, but it was a huge issue in North America, where there was a mysterious problem with their beehives. Beekeepers would arrive out to their yards and they'd have all these dead beehives, and they would have absolutely no explanation, no predictable symptoms, no, detectable specific disease or problem. You just arrive and you'd have dead hives all over the place. And, there was all these, articles and, research and stuff like that going on, going, what the hell is happening here? And, I was there like, sure, if you put sensors into the beehives, you could learn an awful lot more, because again, you only know what's happening inside the beehive when you've got the box open, you've got your face in the middle of the bees. And that's really where I was like, well, you need sensors to help understand this problem and all the other myriad of problems that beekeepers are facing, over the last 20 or 30 years. So I was like, okay, I want to do my PhD in beehive sensors, please.
It's fascinating, but it was really because of the real kind of issue with this colony collapse. You could really kind of, because you must have looked at a number of applications with sensor technology. It must have been, as you said, your structural health and human health, but it sounds like it was really the application and the issue that you saw that you could see the impact, I suppose, right? That's what it sounds like.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, like I said, it was completing a bit of a circle for me personally, because I think, well, with all IoT applications and all, basically all technology applications, understanding where you're taking your technology or your product or your research into is really important, because there still is, and there was back then, a huge amount of research going on into honeybees, into the problems that they were experiencing, and a lot of that research and the science and the technology isn't translating into the real world, because the real world of beekeeping and the real world of agriculture and farming, it's messy, it's complicated, it's very hard to just pick out one problem and say, okay, this is definitely, I definitely didn't get as many vegetables this year because it rained in May. You can't say things like that. It's not science, it's not a scientific environment where you rule out all of the variables. You need to be able to get in there. And coming from a background where I was surrounded by farms and I'd spent a lot of time in farms, I knew what farming was like, and that helped me understand a lot more about the kind of research that I should do. And then when I went on to Apis Protect, it's helped us develop our product really well as well. It's like, even straightforward things like what kind of battery should you use? Because realistically, if you put a rechargeable battery like what's in your mobile phone into a beehive, and then someone drives over it with a forklift, you're going to cause an explosion, And so just simple things like, okay, that battery can't go in this beehive, which, isn't something that would occur to you straight away unless you've spent time out there with the bees, with the farmers, going, okay, there's no way you're going to be able to say, well, you just can't, you just have to mind this. You can't, it won't get minded. That's the reality of the world that you're dealing with. So, and I think, again, that's why Ireland, I think in particular, has such strong potential in terms of ag tech, because I think, I was never interested in agriculture as a child or as a kid or as a teenager when I was surrounded by it. But I think I, like the majority of Irish people, just have a lot more default knowledge about agriculture and food. And, there's so much of that here, and it's of such a high standard that I think, we've got all these people who go off and study engineering, study chemistry, study all these different things, business and stuff like that. I think, bringing that all back around to what we were then surrounded by when we were growing up, and the kind of ambient knowledge that we have, I think that's why ag tech is taking off so well here in Ireland at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Tell me, when you were kind of doing your thesis, what was your actual thesis on, by the way? What was the title of the thesis?
So it was a wireless sensor networks. I can't remember. It was wireless sensor networks, machine learning and wireless sensor networks and signal processing for apiculture, I think.
Right.
So my co-founder, who's now, or my now co-founder, who was one of my PhD supervisors, would probably kick me around the face. That was not the title.
I think,
signal processing and sensors for honeybee monitoring. So it was very, very specific. It was very specific and very broad at the same time. Yeah.
And tell me, when did you realize you were gonna, you have this entrepreneurial hunger and you were going to kind of commercialize and set a company up and dedicate your life towards the problem, for instance?
Yeah, I think people often ask me about that, about, oh, that's a bit of a big change in life, going from your PhD to starting a company. And I don't think it was that much of an unusual change at all, because when you think about, the heart of people who do PhDs and why they do PhDs, and people who start companies and why they start companies, and, they're actually very similar kind of missions. It's I care about what I'm doing. I care about the impact of what I'm doing and what I can achieve, more than I care about whether or not I get a paycheck at the end of the month. So basically, it's really having this challenge that you want to solve more than anything else in the entire world. And so that's, I think, the spirit behind why I'm doing what I'm doing hasn't changed. But at the same time, I think what really drove me founding Apis Protect was realizing, first of all, how much potential there was for this kind of technology in the market. Like, there were technologies available back in 2017 when we founded Apis Protect, but they really weren't super scalable. They were kind of like, they were great if you had 1 or 2 beehives and you had loads of time to be implementing the technology and trying to use it and stuff like that. But we were like, actually, this technology has the most potential in really, really big beekeeping operations. So, operations with hundreds or even thousands of beehives. Those are the guys who are losing a lot of beehives to the kind of problems that sensors can detect very quickly. So what we have to do is create a scalable technology. So put in the engineering and the business development effort in order to get this technology scalable before we then take it to the beekeepers and try to get them to use it. So there was, seeing the opportunity out there, that there was this huge opportunity in the market, and at the same time knowing that there were a lot of beekeepers who were very excited and very enthusiastic for a technology like this. Like, during my PhD, I would regularly get emails and even phone calls from beekeepers saying, "Hi, I heard about your research. We were lucky enough, we got a bit of media coverage in it." And they were like, "Oh, I heard about your research and I really want to get involved. Can I be part of your project? Can I buy one of your sensors off you? Like, I don't even need to be in the research. I just want these sensors in my beehives." So, I mean, like, that's the best position to be in as an entrepreneur. People are ringing you asking if they can buy something off you. You're like, okay, well, let me go make it. And then, yes.
Well, it just seems, it's interesting. I don't know if it's maybe the evolvement of ag tech and the evolvement of the ecosystem, but you being able to kind of take this fundamental kind of core research and apply it to running a company and making a commercial success of it. It's just combining, and it just seems like, you're fundamentally driven by solving a problem, and yet, you're bringing something to the market which is so novel and new as well. So, it's ticking many boxes, it sounds like to me.
Yeah. That's what I thought so too. And I still think so.
So a couple of things. I mean, you mentioned earlier about this colony collapse disorder. Did we ever find out what was causing it? And
it's still such a mystery. I mean, I think now, I'm not a biologist, I'm the engineer, so the technical minutia of the science behind it, I'm not 100% on. But basically, from the point of view of talking to beekeepers over the last few years about the real world of beekeeping, again, a colony collapse disorder has dramatically reduced. It's happening a lot less. There is no real conclusive reason why it was so bad, why it's gotten better. There's a lot of theories that different people have different theories about, was it a disease that was causing this reaction, or was it a problem, or is it something to do with something else in the environment? But, no real conclusive, yes, this is what colony collapse disorder was, but it's less of a problem than it was 10 years ago. Will it become a big problem again? We don't know, because again, it came and went. But what we found actually which was really interesting over the last 4 years at Apis Protect, and again, coming from a research background, we're thinking about the most complicated problems. So colony collapse disorder is the most complicated problem because you've no idea what causes it, no idea how to solve it. Then you've got diseases and pests. There's this pest called the varroa mite, which is a huge problem for beekeepers all over the world because it came from Asia, and with all the transporting beehives around the world, it's now spread to beehives all over the world. So that's a huge problem for beekeepers in Europe and the Americas.
Can you repeat the name of the pest?
Varroa mite.
Varroa,
okay. or OA. Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, an interesting challenge to try and solve, or specific diseases or unusual events in the beehive. And when you're a researcher, when you're an academic, you spend a lot of your time on trying to solve the complicated problems. But what we found when we went out into the real world and we're talking to beekeepers in these big operations, the problems that they don't stay up at night worrying about colony collapse disorder. They're not up at night thinking, oh, do I have nosema in those beehives? They're worried about, are their beehives starving? So really simple problem to solve. You just feed them some sugar. Are my beehives, after being, there was a storm, over there yesterday, did that knock all of my beehives over? But I have to drive like 4 hours to go find out if they were or not. They're losing things like queenlessness. So just the queen bee is dead. So that's, again, a really simple problem to solve. But the challenge that they have is when you have 1,000 beehives, you can't open every single one of them. It's expensive. They have to be physically spread apart. Beehives can only be a certain distance. You can only have so many beehives in an area before they start to compete with each other. You can't just pack them into a field. So they're worried about the straightforward problems, and they're causing actually the majority of the losses in these big operations. So when you're thinking of it from a sensor point of view, these are really, really easy, things to detect, or relatively easy things to detect, I guess, compared to something like colony collapse disorder or how many varroa mites are inside in this one beehive. What we focused on is identifying the simple problems. And actually, when you're doing that, you're solving the majority of the problems that real world beekeepers have.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Thank you for that. And tell me though, I just want to bring it back a little bit to why it matters so much. And I was doing, I'm very interested in understanding the connection between, honeybees and, why it matters, and, how they're going to enable us to kind of feed this growing population of ours, which is going to get to circa an additional 2 billion people in the next 20 or 30 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, everybody's aware that bees are important, and everybody just kind of has this, ambient knowledge that, oh, we need our bees. But nobody, or well, not nobody, but the majority of people don't really get the full connection, how important they are. So bees are a pollinator. And so there's a variety of different kinds of pollinators. You've got a huge different variety of bees. Honeybees are the specific bee that we work with at Apis Protect, but you've got bumblebees, you've got solitary bees, you've got other insects, you've got flies, and then you even in some cases have things like, even birds and bats technically pollinate some foods. But we have some very, very specific pollinator dependent foods in our diet. So about 1/3 of the food we eat every day is a pollinator dependent food. So we're thinking crops like blueberries, cranberries, almonds, apples, cherries, so a lot of
all the nice stuff.
The really nice stuff. Yeah. Tasty food. It's really nutritious food. It's food that's, easy to produce and easy to produce huge amounts of calories that go straight into the human diet. So when we're looking for a more energy efficient food, the kind of foods that we need to make not just a proportion of our diet today, but in, like that in 10, 20, 30 years, we actually need those foods to take up larger proportions of our diet in order to produce more food with less water, with less carbon. These are the foods that really need to make up a huge proportion of our diet, much more than they do today. And those foods are pollinator dependent foods. So they require an insect to fly into them, touch a flower on another plant, touch a flower on another plant, and spread pollen. And that activates the mechanism that actually converts that flower into the fruit or the nut or whatever it ends up becoming that we eat. And we have wild pollinators, which are fantastic. Unfortunately, we're kind of all aware that they're struggling an awful lot. And then when you're trying to intensify agriculture, so wild pollinators are great when you have a couple of almond trees in a forest. But when you have hundreds of thousands of almond trees in a field in California, the only way to successfully pollinate those trees is to bring in honeybees. So that the almond industry is really where the pollination industry started, because those are completely honeybee specifically dependent flowers. So in California, where they produce about 80% of the almonds in the world, they've got 1.3 million acres of almonds. Every one of those acres, in order for them to produce any almonds at all, needs 2 beehives. So mathematically, you need 2.6 million beehives in California every February, because those flowers only open for a few days, and then if you haven't pollinated them, not getting almonds. So simultaneously in California every February, we need 2.6 million beehives. There are only about 2 million beehives in the entire commercial beekeeping industry in the US. And trying to make sure all of those 2 million beehives are healthy enough to go to California is very difficult. So you can see there how we've ended up in a position where, beekeepers make the majority of their money in the US from pollination events. So they get paid about $200 per beehive to just dump their beehives in a field in California for a couple of weeks in February. So that's, multiples of the amount of money that they make from honey, for example.
Got it. How much do they make for dropping the beehives in the fields?
$200. So $200 per beehive. So that's $400 an acre for the beekeepers. At the cost of $400 per acre to the almond growers. So they're going to make $200 a hive from their almond pollination. Almost every beekeeper who does anything with pollination gets involved in the almond industry. Then they might take their beehives to another pollination event, so something like blueberries, cranberries, apples, and then they're going to make about $70 to $90 per event. And then at the end of the year, they might make $100 maybe on honey. So it's completely changed the dynamics of the beekeeping industry in the US. So that's why we're seeing the kind of operations that we work with at Apis Protect, where we've gone from a honeybee farmer who's making honey. It's not a particularly attractive kind of farming. It's a lot of hard work for little return, and you might have a couple of hundred beehives in your operation, into these huge farms where you've got 10, 20, 30,000 beehives managed by a single farmer. They're loading, or owned by a single farmer, managed obviously by a lot more than one person, loading those trucks, or loading those beehives onto trucks. You can get 400 beehives onto the back of a truck in the US, and you're going to drive those beehives from anywhere in the US. So from Florida, from Louisiana, from all of the Dakotas and places like that. All of those beehives are trucked to California and trucked back home after the almond event. So it's become this huge industry, and trying to manage and understand what's going on inside your beehives. And they're not only dangerous to open and difficult to open and far apart from each other, but also traveling all over the country is a very difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. I had no idea. It really is. It's really interesting. And I'm thinking, though, if I'm an almond farmer, this is a key part of my process, right? And I can't afford for there to be colony collapse disorder, and I can't afford to not have honeybees out there pollinating my crops. Otherwise, my business is gonna not be in a great shape, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, we all know about the difficulties around irrigation in California. That's famously a very difficult place to get water into your fields. Almond farmers spend more money on bees than they do on irrigation. So that's kind of, in California, having any line item in your operation that's more expensive than irrigation is unusual, or it's a kind of a exclamation mark item anyway. So beehives. Almond growers and beehives they spend a lot of time thinking about their bees, or about accessing bees.
Got it. So when you look at this, you are looking literally at, some big food production, and you sell a third of the food. And you've outlined some very interesting, some very blueberries and nutritious and nice products there, for instance. But it sounds like you're linking the whole kind of growth and strategy on the business to really solving this kind of, this kind of food security kind of issue, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, we always talk about the US as kind of like the ultimate example, because they've got a couple of different factors. They've got that really intense almond industry that kind of started the whole thing. Also, honeybees aren't native to North America, so they do kind of have to, the honeybees are very much a farmed animal there, as opposed to a wild animal like here in Europe. So they really started the pollination industry and started this conversion from beekeepers being thought of as kind of separate to agriculture, and now beekeepers are a part of agriculture, or a part of the agricultural industry, rather than just kind of people with a nice hobby. But we're seeing that emerging now. I mean, like, Australia, their almond, again, their almond industry is growing very rapidly, and they grow a lot of bee dependent crops in Australia. Canada, we see it as well, particularly around canola or rapeseed oil. So production of that, you can use honeybees. Another way that you can use honeybees, besides just in the first place producing any fruit or vegetables at all, you can also use honeybee or intensive honeybee pollination to improve the yield of a farm. So that when we're talking about canola or even strawberries, so for example, in canola, if the maturity of the output at the end of the day, what you're processing for the oil, how do I express this? correctly. Basically, you're trying to make sure that they all mature as close together as you possibly can. Right. And the best way to achieve that is to pollinate every single flower in a very short space of time. So what you're trying to do is arrive simultaneously with an awful lot of bees and then leave, and then you're going to make a much sharper peak in the kind of maturity of the oil seed. And then when we're thinking about crops like strawberries, so strawberries are not really a pollinator dependent food, so they can be wind pollinated or self-pollinated. But when you introduce insect pollination, and again, honeybees are really the insect we're talking about in an agricultural setting, you can improve the shelf life of the strawberries, the size of the strawberries, the flavor, the nutritional content of the strawberries. So you can increase the value of field strawberries by as much as 54% by introducing pollination to an operation. So you're talking about taking operations that can exist fine without bees into turning them into much more profitable, much higher yield. Ultimately those strawberries, they go from being kind of the bargain basement strawberries that go into things like jam, and take them all the way up into the kind of strawberries that you're purchasing at a premium in the grocery section of your shop. So it can really change an operation just by introducing honeybee pollination.
Interesting. Just a couple of random questions that are on my mind. Basically, I'm thinking, how long does a bee live for?
In the summer, so when they're doing things like pollination, as far as I'm aware, it's about a month. So they don't live very long. There's an awful lot of them. There's about 60,000 inside in a single beehive. So, one thing that people often ask about is, I've heard about people doing drone pollination and stuff like that. Are we going to kind of bypass insects and do this work ourselves? But maybe someday. But one beehive is worth about $200, and in there you've got 60,000 pollinators. So that's something like less than a quarter of a cent is the value of one honeybee, and you have to replace every one of those bees with a drone. So basically, until you can get drones that are good enough to completely randomly distribute their pollination, and then secondly, you need to then make them for less than a quarter of a cent. When you can do that, maybe we can think about replacing honeybees, but until then, we're stuck with nature's way of pollinating crops.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you for that. And so with the business, you founded the business. Am I right in thinking it was about 2018? Is that right?
2017. But
2017. And from where you are now, what's what have been the major milestones in terms of where you've got to right now?
Yeah, so there's it's been a really interesting journey. I mean, I think I say I learn more in every 6 months of Apis Protect, or I have learned more in every 6 months of Apis Protect than I did in 8 years at university. It's been such an interesting journey, and it's changed so dramatically from time to time. And so really started the company in 2017, really started putting together the idea, what we wanted to go after, the whole concept that I was talking about earlier of we need to create a scalable technology for these beekeepers, not just technology. So we went out and we actually raised a seed round of €1.5 million in 2018. So that was fantastic. That was great. First of all, to have money to pursue this technology. It's hardware, it's expensive. It's very difficult to get it off the ground without investment. And secondly, the cohort of investors that we had. So we had Finisterre Ventures and the Atlantic Bridge University Fund. We had the Yield Lab, Radical Growth, and Enterprise Ireland. So that was a really great selection of investors on the ag tech side and the technology side, and also the mixture of American and European investors. So really, people who knew how to get an ag tech company off the ground and had a lot of connections in the areas that we were interested in going into. So we really spent kind of 2018 through 2020 in our kind of research and development phase of the company. So we developed prototypes and put them out into the field. The way our technology works is it's sensors deployed inside in the beehive. We extract that data, things like temperature, humidity, and sound from the hives, and then we apply machine learning to translate that into useful information for the beekeeper. So rather than telling the beekeeper your beehive is 30 degrees, which means basically nothing to a beekeeper, we say, okay, that beehive is growing or that beehive is dead, information that they can take action based on. So we put our 400 prototypes into the field, about 20 million honeybees across the USA, Ireland, the UK, and South Africa, which was really interesting, to collect, first of all, our database on which that machine learning works. So it needs basically a huge database of examples of dead beehives, growing beehives, shrinking beehives, in order to be able to make accurate predictions, and also to road test our hardware. So to understand like challenges, like I mentioned earlier, where, you know, what kind of battery will survive being driven over by a forklift, or the extreme, like you can go up to 60 degrees Celsius all the way down to negative figures inside a beehive. So that's a really interesting environment to try and have electronics survive basically at all, and then be accurate is then a secondary question. So developing out our hardware, understanding things like what networks are available from an engineering point of view. You know, beehives are generally placed in the opposite places where we place things like radio infrastructure. So in mountains, way out in the middle of agricultural land. So do we need to go all the way to a satellite connection solution? We actually found a great solution where we use 4G, which has turned out to be a lot more reliable than we thought it would be. So we use a mixture of 4G and LoRa to collect all of our data. And so basically, 2 years of learning an awful lot about beekeeping, the beekeeping industry, a lot of data, a lot of engineering, which obviously for me was one of the highlights. And late last year, we launched our first product. So late in 2020, we launched our B2B product, so our commercial technology for beekeepers, large-scale beekeepers in the US. So that's basically beekeepers with more than a couple of hundred beehives. So we've been getting beekeepers on board with that since about October last year. And then in January of 2021, we launched our B2C product, so our hobbyist technology for beekeepers here in Ireland. So we've got our commercial technology in the US and our hobbyist technology in Ireland. So we've been pre-selling those since January, and they're going to be available to beekeepers later in the summer of this year. So it's a really exciting time. We've got beekeepers coming online, like commercial customer beekeepers coming online at the moment. So that's a really exciting time for our team. The number of devices we have in the field is rising exponentially, which is again very, very exciting. You know, see all that data coming in.
It sounds like it's been a really great journey, actually, and you know, to get it to where it is now, essentially. And so, if I'm a beekeeper, how do I? Two things actually. You speak about scalability, for instance. What was the key to really building something that was scalable?
Sure. So it was a mixture. I mean, like on the engineering side, it was a mixture of making the technology reliable enough, so like that the battery life and the materials inside the device, making it small enough to fit inside a commercial beehive. So the beehives that we're talking about in the commercial pollination industry, obviously those hives are as small and as light as possible, so they're cheaper to transport around the place. So there's very little spare space inside that box that's not full of bees. So we had to make a very, very narrow, very narrow product. It's about 14 millimeters, or I think that's 3/5 of an inch. Trying to remember my imperial off the top of my head. So that's very, very thin. So it fits into commercial beehives in the US. And the material that the device is made out of, you know, it's in a box with insects that have honey, they've got wax, they've got a thing called propolis, which, you know, again, is not something that everybody knows about, but it's kind of like varnish that the bees use to cover the inside of their beehives, how to keep the sensors working even when they're covered in wax and honey and propolis. And then on the data side, I was trying to get a really, really balanced database, so full of really, really varied, but also consistent quality of examples of beehives. So, you know, trying to get reliable machine learning. It's all about, you know, it's garbage in, garbage out. So we ended up creating a really, really strict protocol around how you collect the information. So basically what you do is you get the sensors give you a set of readings, and then what you need to do is say, okay, those readings are from a healthy beehive, an unhealthy beehive, a beehive that's producing honey, a beehive that's not producing honey. So we created a really, really strict protocol around collecting that second set of information, like how many bees are in that beehive, and we needed a really, really strict protocol around estimating how many bees are in that beehive, which isn't something that's generally done, because beekeepers are trying to do those inspections as fast as possible. They're not too worried about saying, I've got 10 more bees than I thought I had. So we developed something that really, you know, wasn't available beforehand, and then we sent our data scientists and our beekeeper all over the world collecting that information, because we realized we could only trust our own team to do those inspections. You know, as much as with all that, you know, people are really, really helpful and they really want to contribute data, but until we know the exact standard of data that we're getting in, we can't trust it.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. I can imagine. And if I'm a commercial beekeeper, for instance, how much would it cost me, and how would I manage the kind of the cost benefits analysis, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So our commercial technology, it works out on a full deployment at about $3.50 per hive per month. So we've got a subscription-based model, and that's all about making sure that we're then accountable for making sure that the value is seen in those operations. We don't want to be trying to sell people technology that then doesn't ultimately yield anything useful for them. So that's our cost for our technology. That's completely driven by the value that we create inside the commercial operation, and making sure that it balances out for the beekeepers and for us. So beekeepers, we onboard them in a very controlled process as well. So there's kind of a pilot process before you step up to a wider adoption, because we're bringing this technology to an industry that hasn't had an awful lot of technological advancements. I mean, like, I think the last really groundbreaking development in the world of beekeeping was the invention of the forklift, because you could pick up 4 beehives at once instead of 1 beehive at once. And really, that's it. People still use notebooks to collect their information. We've got guys with whiteboards inside their office going, yeah, I inspected that yard yesterday, it was grand. That's the kind of standard of data that generally beekeepers are, and that's purely out of how chaotic beekeeping is, and trying to do all this stuff. You don't have time to stop and type things into an Excel or type things into some software. It's all about, keep going, keep working. So our technology enables them to be able to know, okay, I've got 100 beehives, but actually only 20 of them need my attention today. And then they're able to give those 20 hives their attention, and then take the rest of the time to then reset and think, okay, maybe I'm going to go do some extra stuff, or I'm going to reduce my costs, or maybe I'm now able to track my data in, some kind of software or something like that.
Yeah, no, got it. Okay. And in terms of so the addressable market, you said there's I think there's 2.6 million beehives in the US. Was that the figure? So
yeah,
where how many beehives are you in currently, and where would you where's your vision for where you can take this?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, like, our objective right now is to have between 5 and 10 beekeepers on board in 2021. We're happy that we're progressing away through that. So on board for our pilot, so we're maxing out people at 200 beehives per operation. So that's 2,000 beehives this year. The plan is then to scale pretty dramatically from there. And sorry, 1 second. The maths is taking my break. Can I actually start answering that question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because I don't want to say any numbers that will be wrong here, basically. Sorry, can you ask the question again?
I was just thinking, just in terms of where you are now, and where you want to, where the dream is and the vision is, in terms of where your technology would be deployed, and how many different beehives do you think in the next 5 years, for instance?
That's a really good question. So yeah, absolutely. We're working on right now with our commercial technology, want to bring between 5 and 10 beekeepers on board for a pilot this year. We're also, after rolling out our technology, so our hobbyist technology in Ireland, and the Irish beekeepers listening will probably already said this to them, but we've got a limit of 200 devices available in Ireland for this year. And then before the end of this year, we actually want to launch our hobbyist technology in another European market. So we haven't completely nailed down which country that is. I'd love to announce what it is. But pretty much, we're talking a couple of thousand devices over the next 12 months. And from there, we want to scale to as fast as we possibly can. But I would certainly have ambitions of over 100,000 devices, within the next 5 years.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, and one device is one hive, so 100,000 hives.
Definitely. And do you see this as being the main product, for instance, or do you see other products, designed for the industry, as it were?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think right now the product that we have is it's very useful, and the things, so we're telling beekeepers things like where hives are growing, where hives are shrinking, which beehives are basically behaving differently. So those are the ones that really need their attention. And what I see being probably our first big step will be, as we get more beehives in the field, if we go from 400 devices last year to 800 devices, say this year, say double the number of beehives, that's twice as much data. we're going to be able to tell as we get more beehives using our technology, we'll be able to tell more information. So not necessarily a new piece of hardware that goes into the beehive, but extra insights into things that we can't detect right now. Like I'd love to be able to detect, say, cognitive collapse disorder, perhaps, or some other more complicated problems that can have very, very specific actions to address them. And then long term, yeah, absolutely. We're always exploring, new sensors to add in to our device. As new sensors become, cheap and reliable enough to get into the kind of hardware that can, viably be installed in every single beehive, it's going to be really interesting to see what new things we'll be able to detect with that.
Absolutely, that sounds really exciting. How many people do you have in the company?
We've got 11 in our team right now. So that's split between our team here in Ireland, where we do kind of business development and R&D work. And we've got our sales team based in South Dakota in the US. So that's right there in the middle of, there's an awful lot of beekeepers in the Midwest. So it's a fantastic area for us to be based in over there. So really exciting to have a team here in Ireland and a team in the US.
Got it. No, absolutely. And no, it sounds very exciting. And just tell me, as a first-time CEO, kind of final question for me, when you look at the whole journey, you look at your vision, what's been the biggest challenge you think as a first-time CEO for you?
Oh, there's been a lot of challenges, I guess. Something that I've noticed is, every time you think you're at the maximum of what's going to be going on. So in terms of like understanding your market or understanding your product or investment and stuff like that, every time you think you've got a handle on something, it changes. So it's such a changeable environment, I guess. Like what I'm doing day to day is just literally completely different every couple of months, and it will continue to be different every couple of months. There's no such thing as saying, okay, this is my job as a CEO. There is no job. It's everything and it's nothing and it's anything at any given moment of the day or night. Yeah. And trying to come to terms with that and see the positive sides of that as well. I mean, like one thing I didn't want when I started, or when I was thinking about what job do I want, I was like, I don't want to be doing the same thing every day at work. I want to always be challenged and be learning in my role. And absolutely, yeah, 100%, my entire job is that as the CEO.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's been tailor-made for you. It really has. It sounds like you're having a great time. And Fiona, yes, it's been brilliant having you on the show today. It's been a real education. I feel that I've learned. I feel like I've learned a lot, and it's been great hearing about your story and about your mission and vision. And just wanted to wish you all the very best for your future.
Great. Thanks so much, Simon. It was a great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Pleasure. Oh, Fiona.